Thank you for coming to this workshop today. And I think to start out, I'll just point out that there's going to be filming and recording of what happens. So if you're happy with that, we'll carry on. If you're not happy, let us know and we can stop. So there's nobody got any objections. Nobody's where they shouldn't be, or they're going to be discovered to be who they really weren't. That's good. As well, as far as I know, there are no planned fire alarms and things, so if you hear one, it's real. Evacuate through the route out of the front of the building. My name is Neil Pendleton. I'm a researcher from the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences, and I'm a clinician. I work with older adults in hospitals and look at the health of older adults, but I also do a lot of research on human aging and aging of older adults, and I think today they've asked me to come and give you an overview of methodological considerations when you're going to do research involving older adults. All the slides from today I think are going to be on the website for this particular event, and mine does have at the end links to specific papers or sites with useful information. So a lot of what I say is encapsulated in those papers. So for some very simple, I presume to change the slides we just use the mouse, which is actually tethered down. So that means I've got to stand here and I can't walk about. So you'll have heard in every talk about aging that we have a demographic shift in the world population, that in the UK 1 in 6 is now over 65, and there's about 3 million 80 plus year olds. And obviously working pension relationships are quite interesting, and these are changing despite the change in retirement age. And because of that, I've seen a transformation in interest in the ageing research agenda, because perhaps 10 years ago there was less interested in ageing research than there is now. I think because of this demographic shift we've seen a big change, and people want to understand more about this change in population demographics. However, if we look at the other side, and this is as it were a slightly unique slide for Manchester, but this is data from Greater Manchester looking at recruitment to clinical research. And these are all the topics they can be in. So primary care, cancer, mental health. And as you see, we go down and down and down and down and down. And the recruitment in ageing is 105 compared to primary care, which is over 6,000, or cancer over nearly 4,000. So despite the demographic changes we're seeing, we're not seeing the similar increases in research on older adults. And what's happening is studies that are interested in aging and the health of older adults are being encapsulated in lots of these studies who aren't always conducting the research in the best way one could to capture a real perspective of human aging. So we've got this imbalance between the priority and actually delivery of research. So as you've seen, we've got underrepresentation of older adults in research on any topic, not just aging itself. And there are some peculiar challenges to research in older adults. Many are exaggerated effects for all ages, but some are quite specific. And I think appreciation of these helps you to get your research right, or helps you use your data correctly. So we're going to sort of talk about three sort of key areas. One is recruitment, one is retention, and one is analysis, because clearly many studies on aging will involve both recruitment and retention. And without those things being properly conducted, they will introduce biases which will cause problems. So, sample considerations. So, when you're planning your research, you need to know the characteristics of the sample that you require. Do you require a population sample? Do you require a sample particularly stratified or enhanced for certain characteristics? And this is one of the advantages of doing some pilot work first to test how those characteristics are important. You need to make contact with the population, or as I put it here, the gatekeepers. So older adults are obviously disseminated through the community, but like many groups, getting contact with either all of them or a subpopulation of them can be challenging. So you need to get contact with your target population. And often you'll find there may be certain gatekeepers to this. This may involve their networks, the places which they spend their time, the people they spend their time with. Many studies fail around communication and dissemination. So you want to do a study on a particular group of older adults who live in a particular part or a particular type of geolocation. Make sure you've got the right information in the right media and account for limitations that might affect people's uptake. So classic ones are auditory limitations, visual limitations, functional limitations that affect who sees your advertisement. Classically, in the kind of research I see in medical health sciences, a lot of it obviously lives off the gold standard of the randomized controlled trial, which is held up in medicine as the ultimate standard piece of research. That has particular problems when you're dealing with older adults, because part of the RCT phenomena or ideology is to have very clearly defined exclusion-inclusion characteristics. Sadly, these can produce quite unrepresentative populations of older adults in the research. And that's why a lot of the data that we base our certainly health policy and decisions around is probably based on biased information from studies that were set up to study a disease or an organ of interest rather than capturing the kind of real life population that these problems exist in. So, exclusion can be a big issue. Obviously, you've got to try and be inclusive as much as you can in your recruitment. And another problem that we see frequently in older adult research is failure to accrue to target sample. So, obviously, for most research to gain an adequate research outcome at the end, you want to get up to your proposed sample to explain the analysis that you want to look at. In ageing research, it's particularly important to track accrual and have a plan B, because often if you don't track accrual quite real time, you will find yourself coming to the end of study with quite disappointingly sized samples. And you've got to have on the modifiable strategies to let you get to sample size. So you need to promote participation, because the biggest problem we have in ageing research is this selectivity of recruitment and getting biased samples. So there's a lot of ways in which one can do that. So more and more we're trying to use older adults as drivers in the research, not just participants, and involving them in advisory boards. Getting their views and vision of what we're doing is important. It can really help to improve participation. Developing relationships with the individuals and with communities. If you want to sample from a community, your ability to do so will greatly improve by developing a relationship with them and showing that you've got an interest in them and what are their questions. Obviously, in certain types of health research, there are clear benefits because you're paid to participate, particularly in drug trials. But for a lot of research, a lot of people participate for very modest benefit to themselves. And obviously, benefits and rewards to participants are not about paying them to participate, but more actually saying, we value you doing this. There's a big misconception in research in older people that they are free of any commitment. So in other words, you've retired, you don't work anymore, you've not got children to look after, so you must be available to do whatever I want because you've got all the time in the world. You're retired, you're living free. This is totally wrong. Their lives are just as engaged as ours are, and therefore they have burdens to participation and they have to make arrangements, particularly in their life, to come and participate. So think of them like everybody else, that you've got to make and think about the effects this has on their participation. It's probably true of all research, but particularly for older adults, take account of travel effects. So if you're going to study people, think about their functional and mobility-related issues around the research you're going to do. Will that bias the people that you're going to access? Have you got plans to ensure that that doesn't reduce your cohort because of that effect? And obviously minimise the impact of health or functional impairment. So you've got to create experiments, methods, data collection approaches that minimise limitations, because with ageing it obviously comes decline in a variety of senses and functions, which mean participation, like coming to a location to participate in a cohort study, can be very challenging. And there are lots of examples of this where they opt out because it involves them getting to somewhere where they can't get to. And obviously, like all research, you've got to plan around specific issues in their ethnicity, language and culture, but a special flavour in ageing research because there are cohort and generational specific effects that come across that mean it's not just the standard cultural balances you have to think about, but are there generational differences as well. So, easy things like information about the study. Make it something that they can easily see, it's attractive, they can engage with. Have a clear idea about the study's effect on convenience and comfort. Because certainly in health research, we find ageing research a particular challenge because most people participate in a lot of health research because they have some stake in the outcome, such as they want to be involved in motor neuron research because they are a patient, they are a relative of a patient, they are a partner of a patient, so they've got a stake in taking part. In ageing, everybody is ageing, so the idea that they will participate just because they're an older adult and they should participate in ageing research is slightly different to them than it is to participate in a research around a particular health problem. And also, as is so in all research, track concerns while you recruit and try to find out from members of the research study, perhaps post-participation, what were any barriers and challenges to participation that they could see. They will see and experience things far more than you and I would be able to dream up. Another key failing for a lot of people, if you've got teams working with older adults in the research, is that they don't understand what it's like to research in older adults and to engage with and work with older adults. And this can be quite a turn-off to participants. They think, I'm working here with people who don't really understand anything about the life I experience and what I do. And obviously, as we said before, collect feedback regularly. So in the planning of your study, you've got to think about feasibility, and we often talk about a recruitment ratio, a sort of screen to recruitment ratio plan. So in other words, and sometimes this will come out of your pilot study where you can have some sort of idea of numbers need to go through screening to actually recruit. And sometimes the ratio can be quite big. One thing we often do in research in older adults, because they are more prone to incidental events that can prevent them continuing, is try to plan the study around high resource steps later in projects, where you've got more stake to lose from the higher resource intensive steps. So you might plan to have some of the more less resource intensive steps early on, more resource intensive steps later. Consider the geography of study sites around convenience and access is quite simple. And often what we'll do is track screen to recruitment ratios against our piloted ratios that we've delivered and check that recruitment is going according to proposed recruitment to screen ratio. Because if it isn't, that means something's not working, particularly in multi-site studies. So you're recruiting other people, you get to recruit people, and many research that's done in older adults is interested in doing longitudinal based research and not so much cross-sectional. And we can talk about the benefits between the two of using cross-sectional versus longitudinal research. Obviously, there are some benefits and negatives to both, but longitudinal research seems to have become more and more the flavour for looking at ageing questions. So retention is a big part of that, and dealing with lack of retention equally another big issue. So if you want to retain people, you need to understand why it is they're engaging with the research and why they don't want to do the research any longer. And you've really got to not expect them to overtly come out with what were my problems with engaging. You've got to ask them, because many of them will not say, they'll just leave. You've really got to, I think, more and more now, and I know the research councils expect it, show that you have stakeholder involvement in advisory and steering groups, people who are involved in planning the research and conducting the work as well as being members of the research protocol. And you need to plan time for retention activities. So during the course of longitudinal studies, if you have spaces between measurement, these are gaps where people can believe A, the study doesn't exist any longer, B, maybe it's changed, C, do I really want to do it any longer? So retention activities, these can be communicated by distance, obviously through mail, through internet, or they can be actual sessions where you meet with people and just update them about what has been going on with the research, what's coming next, that the research is still ongoing. Because otherwise you may know you've got a longitudinal programme of funding and they'll have no idea. And what they remember from the first episode is often quite small. And try to have a stable research team. That's very challenging because obviously financially that can be very difficult. But older adults prefer to engage with research teams that they're familiar with, and they'll build up a relationship that makes them want to participate. So that's challenging but difficult. So for recruitment and retention, The key points I think to think about are doing pilot studies, the membership of your advisory boards, test subjects dry run of protocols, train and maintain staff and use what resources are available to try to recruit and retain people. So this is some information. Don't worry about all this because the paper is listed at the end, which is open access to you. And this is some information about how people consider public engagement in research, or particularly for older adults. So there's a hierarchy of it, from consultation, collaboration to actual user control. And what you want to be doing is moving more and more from consultation down to user control. Because studies that are successful, more and more are working alongside older adults who are actually performing research activity within the study. And if you want to recruit people to engage in steering your research, there are a number of effective steps which can be involved to try to improve this. So these are all really lots of things we've said already, but this is based on some systematic research evidence. Marion McMurdo is a researcher in Dundee. So for the first part of this, we've talked a lot about the practicalities of conducting research in new research projects where you're collecting new data or working on things where you're planning new studies or engaging with new recruits. And the other side of this is really things to think about when you're thinking about analysing data from ageing research. So there are certain differences clearly about ageing research than there are from perhaps other age structures of research. So for example, if you research on younger adults or perhaps sort of early middle-aged adults, the reasons for sample characteristics and attrition are quite different than they are when you're studying adults of 80 plus. And so attrition is a big issue, but clearly death becomes a very important issue in analysis. And really, understanding the contribution of death to the results of your data is pretty critical. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we have this argument between which is better, cross-sectional or longitudinal results. So cross-sectional data, which spans ages and looks at single time points, the characteristic of interest between 90-year-olds and 60-year-olds or 50-year-olds, or people who follow older adults over time, looking at how they change, how their lives change as they get older. And there are lots of pros and cons for each of those. But as I've said, the big issue for ageing research seems to be biases. So if your data has come from hospital resources, rehabilitation units, primary care, you've got to consider some particular issues around what that will include. So depending on the data you're looking at, you've got to consider what will the health effects during the early admission have an effect of the overall data. So if you're looking at data on people's experience of hospital events during their time in hospital while being admitted as an older adult, the early health effects will affect your sample and the biases within your sample. So in other words, those who become very ill, those who die, will certainly cause biases within the data that you end up with. You've got to think about the effect that the research is having on the usual care. So a lot of people want to do studies on usual care versus intervention X or treatment model X. But when you're doing that study, having a usual care group is very difficult because there is contamination by the fact that you're actually studying in that environment. Again, a lot of your success will boil down to your relationship between key members of the team in that location. So, depending on what you want to do in these organisations, whether it be primary care or hospital, secondary care, it's engagement with the key people within that organisation. And keeping track of movement. Patients are quite mobile people now, and movement is a particular issue. And in primary care research, you will always have very high recruitment to retention ratios, because there are very similar biases to the kind of problems you have in population research. Some people want to research on older adults in care homes. You've got these silos of older adults who sometimes are picked out for particular types of research, because older adults are as diverse as young adults. There are older adults of all sorts of descriptions and types, but then there are cohorts living in slightly different environments. So care home environments are becoming a more and more interesting source for research in older adults, because frighteningly, people often end their lives in these organisations, and we know very little about how their lives and their health and well-being evolves during their time in care homes. Most of the data we have is very crudely things like survival rates between different places, nursing homes versus residential homes. For example, average figures. If you're admitted to a residential home, your average life expectancy will now be about 24 months. If you're admitted to a nursing home, it will be about 10 months. So, and they're roughly all we know. But we don't know things like what are lives like in homes, how does one deliver health, care, quality of life to people in these organisations. So more and more these are being researched. So researching with them is slightly different. You've got to engage with different organisations. The Care Quality Commission, who monitor these organisations, but also companies. Care homes are paid for, and nursing homes, by private organisations. Some are single unit organisations and some are companies. So you've got Bupa, various other places, who govern large numbers of these homes. So you have to sort of engage with different groups of people with different agendas. So will Bupa see things the way you want to do the study? Culture and organisation in care homes is very different. You need to understand it. And you've also got to consider the governance frameworks that occur in local authorities. So care homes is a growing area of research, but quite a challenging one with a number of issues. Another issue that crops up a lot in work on older adults is this concept of subjects having the ability to consent to research and engage in your research. So the idea that the person is able to understand, has the mental capacity to agree to participate in your research, unless it's research where that agreement is felt not to be necessary. And there are certain types of research that's the case. So, if you look at the hospital population, 30% of the adults in any hospital will have cognitive impairment or dementia. The nature of hospitals is now that 50% of the occupancy is over 65, and 30% of the occupancy will probably have some form of dementia and cognitive impairment. If you move up to care homes, 80% of those individuals will will have a dementia and probably have issues around mental capacity. So if you're focusing on that environment, you've got to consider both the Mental Capacity Act and its areas of research, which there are research sections, and the idea of will your research be able to be conducted in the absence of individualised consent. And there's this other issue you have to consider sometimes, which is capacity can be transiently lost and not permanently lost. So you can have a confusional state, a delirium, you can be unconscious, you don't have capacity because you can't engage in the decision. But you can regain it, and you've got to have opportunities to allow people to say something about that. Clearly, again, you've got to think about how are ethnic groups represented in research. We know that generally in health research in the UK, which I know most about so I can talk about, there's a lot of underrepresentation of some of the groups that now form a large part of our population.
And accessing them can require differences in ways of contact and engagement. Some of it relates particularly to older adults from these cultures, to past experience of when they've been perhaps younger members of society living in them and dealing with the organisations that they're asked to deal with. Okay, so some analysis considerations. Missing data. So I'm sure you're all quite interested in missing, well, you may not be interested in missing data, but hopefully you are interested in missing data, because missing data is actually quite informative. And I'm sure, I don't know what other presentation you may have been to today, but you may have even talked about what missing data means and the meaningfulness of it. It's not peculiar to aging research, but there's far more risk from missing data in aging research. And as always, steps you take to prevent missing data where you can are greater than trying to cure the problem analytically later. So the big thing about missing data is there's no way it doesn't bias your results. Whatever you think, it will bias the results. It reduces the range of effects as well, which is quite important. So what can you do about missing data from a planning point of view? So you can think about your research question and design to make it efficient so that you minimize the risk of missing data as much as you can. And look at your key questions and key domains of collection and make them a priority to collect. Because it's always helpful to collect an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary spread of data, particularly in older adults, where most problems are quite complex and multi-system. But you've got to be quite clear on what priority collection is and try and promote the high completion of these priority facts in a good representative sample population. So there's things about adapting study visits, sites, duration even can be something that can affect missing data factors. And then there are measures that you might introduce to deal with it. So you've got to anticipate the effects of health and functional impairments on data collection. And of course in aging research there's a lot of places where we use proxy informants because individuals can become impossible to actually have contact with. So you could also look at, can you change the way that you're going to measure outcomes, sort of adjudication or definition of outcomes? And also, can you look at combining outcomes way where you can lose certain pieces of information and still get a core outcome measure. Sometimes you have to think about non-fixed time point collections. I know it's nice to have data spurs around standard time points if you're doing longitudinal research, but it might be possible to use a mixed time point collection to get your data to reduce this probability of losing data. And of course, you might be able to use a mixed time point collection based on characteristics that lead to missingness. So inform that decision by things you know from pilot data that will say missingness is more likely in these situations. Can we structure our time visits so that we try and capture those who are likely to disappear? And prioritize collection sequences. So what you can do is, obviously, for intervention, you can look at fidelity of study protocol, look at the success of blinding, look at the expectations of controls, which are a group you can lose as much as intervention. They can be quite challenging to keep hold of. You can use pilot studies to test problems and revise your protocol with experience, which I think, again, pilot studies are very important. Again, it's about having flexibility in your protocol. Most health research protocols are very strict, and that comes from the research governance framework, which says you must do what you said you would do in your application. But one of the dangers of that is if you make your protocol very strict, you could start to affect the way in which you can collect representative data. And this idea of real-time tracking and having reporting systems for missing data, not waiting till the end of collection points to see where the problems occur, doing it real time. And more and more people look at real time measurement in losing from studies. So, as there is on this side of the table, there are a number of ways of defining missing data. I'm sure you will all know these far better than you may, or may not know these far better than me. There's completely NCIR, missing completely at random, and then there's missing at random, and there's missing not at random. And they all have different definitions, different examples, and different prevalences. There's a number of ways of dealing with missing data. Some statisticians in health sciences will simply say, if it's less than 5%, I'm not worried about the missing data, I will exclude them. Simple exclusion is quite commonly done for that sort of threshold of test. I don't think it's very good, I think it's problematic, but that's the decision that some people take. If you're not going to exclude people because of missing data, then you've got to think about how you're going to interpret the missing data, because it's not just this information is not there anymore, it's what does it mean, the information behind the missing data. So if you start by believing that your missing data is not completely at random, which I think I can't actually think of a case where missing data isn't completely at random, then you've got to think about characterizing how is that data missing. And characterizing it in some way to try and tease out what the reasons, what's the actual information behind the fact it's missing. And missing not at random is not overcome by adjustment of baseline characteristics. That's what a lot of people do. Say, well, if I adjust my model of baseline characteristics, that will make an announcement. It will not. It will generally still give you biased results. So you've got to think about, why is the data missing? You've got a variety of types of non-response, unit non-response, item non-response, and wave non-response. Measuring proxy data by interviews, by other approaches, does not always overcome the effects of death. Death is a particularly peculiar type of missing data that has real problems. I think you need to incorporate death in your analytical model, and I'll show you an example in a second about if you don't consider death, how much it affects the results that you can get. And one can think about using sensitivity analysis to try and look at the biases of missing data within your data. So, missing data, if we agree it has an effect to decrease the power in all types of study, and we will often have participants with partial outcome data. Many people will use things like mixed models or GEE, but even they have some problems, limitations, dealing with death in particular. Death is a particular type of missing data that's very, very unique. And a common way that people are now starting to think about doing it is to use shared latent models, which one has two linked models which change over time, and one for cessation, i.e. death. And I'll show you an example of this in a second. So what sort of analytical approaches has been saying? People will say you can do list-wise deletion for missing completely at random, but I really don't believe that's ever the case, and that's really reasonable. Dummy variable adjustment, but probably still gives you biased estimates despite using that approach. There's of course something that's grown more and more perhaps in the last perhaps decade is to use imputation, including multiple imputation. But there are even challenges in doing that. You really need to understand, as I say, the rationale for the missingness to be able to impute, and you've got to have substantial code data that will allow you to perform that imputation. And then something that's becoming more popular is to use missingness screens, which is a two-step approach where you've got a complete data set analysis and you use it to make candidate reduction in your variables and then introduce multiple imputation. But let's think about this. So there is a concept called competing risks. So as you go along in life, you can have competing risks. You can have competing risks of having an infection, competing risk of buying a car, etc. So a competing risk is defined as an alternative outcome which is of equal or greater importance than the primary one, and it alters the probability of the outcome. And this is, for aging, usually mortality. So you can see a number of risks I've put in there that are competing risks in aging studies, but death is the common one. And here's an example. So a standard tool that's used in health research is to use for risks of second events, the use of originally defined survival protocols. So there are things like the Kaplan-Meier log-rank test and Cox regression to allow you to use some level of censorship across time. So we've got a time to event outcome here, which is hip fracture, which is common in older people and a very important problem. And we can use those two methods to give us a risk of a repeated event, which is a second hip fracture, which is a real potential risk. And if we use those, we can give ourselves a risk of, if you've had a hip fracture, what's your chances of getting a second hip fracture? And we can do it that way, or we can do it this way, where we use competing risks as a latent random effect. And to show an example of this, just think about the baseline data. If we start with the Framingham Study, which you may be familiar with, it's a longitudinal study in America, which is largely based on cardiovascular risk of death. But they measure other outcomes as well. And that population gradually came older and older. There are 481 subjects, and the second hip fracture was only seen in 15% of adults. And it's only seen in that many adults over that time point, because 73% died during the study. Don't worry, that's me telling myself I've got to finish. So that means that what's the effect? If we're going to say to someone who's broken their hip, here's the risk of having another hip fracture, it's not just the risk there is of having another hip fracture, it's the risk of having a hip fracture in the context of the fact that you might well die in the meantime. Because at year 1 after hip fracture, 30% are dead. And here's an example of that. So first, this is a plot of the hazard for having a second hip fracture based on considering different mortality latent models. And as you can see, it has dramatic effects on the risk. The same is true if you use a Cox regression model of competing risk using the covariates. Whereas one would say with Cox regression, there is always a significant increased risk of hip fracture. It started to drop quite dramatically over time because of this competing risk of death. So the model you choose can give you different results. Of course, don't forget to report missing data, which most people don't, because they think it will upset the reader or the editor. So let's think about repeated measures very quickly. Longitudinal research, as I say, is big in Asian research now, and the idea is you can measure something sequentially over time and look at how things change. But what you have to consider always is, and this is true not just for Asian research, but others, is how does this contamination of prior exposure have on your response to any particular result in any particular analysis? So here's a quick example of cognitive aging. These are two plots of cognitive aging from an American study by Tim Salthouse. This is what's called crystal intelligence, the knowledge of vocabulary, and this is very well maintained across life. So basically, intellectually, your crystal intelligence stays very well maintained until you're close to death, and then it diminishes very, very rapidly. But across the life course, your intelligence falls. Sadly, after you're about 30, everybody's brain is degenerating. So the question has always been, that's a cross-sectional measure, is that true for individuals who participate sequentially in the same study? So in other words, we should be able to show that if we take adults who age, that their intelligence is dropping over time. Well, here's an experiment where you measure cohort level function over ages, and you do repeated tests. So you take a cohort, and then you have an inception cohort at the next time point, which show a decremental decline. But as you can see, when you repeat a cognitive test in the same cohort of adults in the same time interval, you get an improvement. So you've got a problem. Because cross-sectionally, you're getting worse. Longitudinally, you're getting better. And this is a big problem in cognitive aging research. And this consideration of how does one manage what is a counterintuitive improvement in cognitive function is something that is a very central point of research. So, we can end now so you can get to the next talk. When you're doing aging research, consider the effective age at all stages of your research. Whether you're working on establishing a study, running a study, or looking at the data from the study. And always, if you can, although I know for many areas of research you're using existing data, prevention of issues is better than trying to resolve them analytically. Analytical solutions will always have problems. You've really, in aging research, got to have a very thorough approach to dealing with biases, because there are some very significant biases which can have quite huge effects on the estimates that you produce. And what I would say is use all the available resources you can to get working papers, information, even experts to give you some advice on what you might need to think about in aging research. And these are a list of useful papers on the topic, and there's a good site at the American Geriatrics Organization which has a lot of tools for researchers who are going to work on aging and older adults. So thank you, and I know there's probably not a lot of time now for questions, but if you've got any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Yeah, this will all be on the website later anyway, so don't worry, because you'll be able to get this as a slide. So what sort of work are you planning to do any aging research?
Well, I am conducting a research I will start on baby boomers, because they are a very large part of the population, and they are interesting me from different perspectives. And they are right now in the verge of retirement, which also imposes a lot of issues on them. So my research has a complication, which is that it's from the point of view of anthropology, so I really don't deal a lot with numbers, but deal a lot with individual people.
Well, that's where some of these advisors can help, because it really is about trying to engage with those people. And a lot of that is establishing relationships with communities and networks that these people are involved in. Because certainly in health research, we've seen lots of problems which are unique to aging, because it's, as I've said, easy to find a group of people who are interested in motor neuron disease or pediatric leukemia, because they've often had a stake in that problem, or they can empathise with that problem. But aging seems quite a nebulous concept to many people, even though we are all getting older, we're all getting closer and closer. Retirement transitions are very common questions now in aging research, because it's seen as an event which is quite common across different individuals, and it's quite a useful instrumental version for some people. But still, you've got to think about, I think the definition of retirement is key there, because there's a variety of routes to retirement, which include early retirement, and then there's working beyond the retirement age, and there's then the different biases that introduces, such as early retirement might be for health reasons, might be for financial reasons. So retirement is difficult, And often it's about having very good definition of what you're going to mean by the concept of retirement. Because it's not one universal. Death is pretty standard. Most people will agree what death is. Although the police don't. Because the police have a different definition of death to doctors. For a policeman to pronounce death, the head must be separated from the body. I'm full of useless bits of information, but that is true. So a policeman cannot pronounce death unless the head is separated from the body. It requires the medical examiner to come. So they can say, possible life extinct is the way they do it. But if the head's chopped off, they're allowed to say they're dead. I think it's because they don't expect transplantation's going to work basically. So yeah, I hope that's given you a flavour of what potential problems might be, and different. You've got to think about it differently depending on which end of the research you are. But even if you're receiving data, you've got to deal with older adults in that data. Just consider some of these issues that can really bias the information and transform the results that you get. So good. I hope you enjoy the rest of the seminars.